I've taken them bits and pieces here or there, whether it be attitude, whether it be presentation, whether it be the way.
Phil Anselmo, a name that made the entire metal world hold its breath. On stage, he wasn't just a singer, but a storm made flesh. His voice was no longer just sound, but a weapon, tearing through every boundary and forcing a whole generation to scream along. With Pantera, Anselmo became the very soul of groove metal, the raw, guttural roar of the 1990s, a sound that redefined brutality and authenticity in heavy metal. But behind that glory lay a very different story. A body ravaged by injuries and addiction, a mind tormented in solitude, and a heart that more than once stopped beating on the brink of death. He was a man disowned by the very brothers he once trusted most, a man abandoned by the world after words he could never take back. For years, Anselmo lived as if there was no tomorrow, or perhaps as if he no longer wanted one. Phil Anselmo is no perfect legend. He fell, he hurt others, and then he tried to rise again from his own ashes. And it is precisely this imperfection that makes his journey worth telling. A rebel searching for himself in the darkness, a scream that refuses to die out, even as the world around him has changed countless times. So who is Phil Anselmo really? The truest voice of a repressed generation, or the victim of the very fire he once ignited? A living legend, or an exiled soul still trying to find his way home? Philip Hansen Anselmo was born on June 30th, 1968, in New Orleans, Louisiana, a city both radiant and shadowed. On the surface, it was the cradle of jazz, of Mardi Gras bursting with colors, of the interwoven threads of French, Italian, and Creole culture. But beneath that glittering surface, New Orleans was also a land of poverty, crime, and streets crisscrossed with darkness. Phil grew up in that paradoxical intersection between soaring music and chaotic reality. His father, Philip Anselmo Sr., an Italian-American, ran an Italian-style restaurant where customers could enjoy food alongside live music. It should have been an environment to nurture Phil's musical roots. But in truth, what he felt most was distance. His parents divorced when he was still young, leaving a home deprived of affection. His relationship with his father was little more than formal, never close enough to warm a child already troubled inside. Phil was one of 3 siblings, and within that family, the small boy with bright eyes carried a mischievous streak so dangerous it could ignite. Once, just to tease his sister, he played with fire. But the prank spun out of control. The entire house caught flames, forcing the family to rebuild almost from scratch. The incident marked his childhood as proof of his volatile nature, always ready to explode without thinking of the consequences. School was never a sanctuary for Phil either. He was constantly punished, repeatedly transferred from one school to another because of his violent temper and impulsiveness. His academic performance was unimpressive, yet even the teachers exhausted by his antics admitted one thing. This boy had a strange imagination and an unusual gift of observation. Those very traits, reckless, sensitive, vividly imaginative, would later fuse into the ferocious, raw, and haunting music that defined his art. During his teenage years, Phil also worked with his stepfather on shrimp boats. There, he witnessed a scene that would haunt him for life, a crewman dying before his eyes, poisoned by a scorpion fish. For a boy already stubborn by nature, that sight wasn't just fear. It carved into him a sense of life's fragility and cruelty. From then on, Phil withdrew further, seeking refuge in the only place he could feel safe: music. In his small New Orleans room, Phil discovered records by Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Slayer, Venom, Black Flag. The crushing riffs, rebellious lyrics, and anti-establishment spirit became a shield for the anxious boy. "I didn't turn to metal for entertainment," Phil later admitted. "I turned to it because I needed something to scream for me." At 14, Phil tried learning guitar, but the 6 strings didn't satisfy him. What truly allowed him to find himself was his voice, or more precisely, a raw, guttural scream torn from his gut. Without any formal training, Phil taught himself, screaming until hoarse, growling, pushing his vocal cords to the edge. That explosive voice wasn't technique. It was primal energy, untamed and unfiltered. That energy soon carried Phil into local bands like Samhain, unrelated to Glenn Danzig's group, and Razor White. Though still just a skinny teenager, he became the center of the stage with his wild performances, fiery eyes, and a roar that terrified yet mesmerized. In the smoky New Orleans bars, people saw a boy battling himself through music, a war no one else could truly understand. In a city that belonged to jazz and funk, Phil chose metal. Unlike his peers, he didn't dream of a steady career. He only wanted to stand on a stage and scream until every silent wound inside was drowned out. For Phil, fame was never the destination. Survival itself was already a battle. And as his teenage years drew to a close, an invitation arrived from Texas. Pantera, a band struggling after 3 failed albums, needed a new singer, and they called the name Phil Anselmo. In 1986, at just 18 years old, Phil Anselmo received a fateful call from Arlington, Texas. It was Pantera, a band still stuck in the flashy haze of glam metal, with teased hair stiffened by hairspray, shiny leather pants, high heels, and 3 independently released albums that few listeners remembered. After Terry Glaze left, Pantera lost their frontman, and they knew that without change, the road ahead would lead only to dead ends. They needed a spark, a scream to shatter the hollow cycle, and at that very moment, the name Phil Anselmo, the young kid from New Orleans, entered the picture. From the very first audition, the atmosphere changed entirely. Phil didn't bring the polished glamour of a rising star. Instead, he brought rawness, ferocity, a primal surge of energy that made the rehearsal room explode. Dimebag Darrell, Pantera's guitar prodigy, immediately recognized that this was the missing piece. Phil had something that couldn't be rehearsed, couldn't be taught, a scream that wasn't meant to please, but to challenge, to conquer with sheer, unfiltered power. Phil didn't just join Pantera, he breathed new life into them, resurrecting the band from the ashes of glam metal. With Phil, Pantera transformed almost overnight. The gaudy outfits, candy-coated hairstyles vanished, replaced by shaved heads, black t-shirts, cargo pants, and ink-covered skin. Their music changed, too. Gone were the flashy riffs designed to please. In their place came a heavier, more violent, brutally honest sound. Phil was the catalyst pushing Pantera into new territory, groove, thrash metal, a collision of thrash's relentless brutality and the crushing street-born rhythm of groove. In 1988, Pantera released Power Metal, their first album with Phil. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was a declaration. The glam era was over. Phil's raw screams and blazing eyes led the transformation, turning Pantera's sound into something sharp and jagged, swallowing listeners in a storm of noise. A year later, in 1989, Pantera signed with major label Atco Records. This wasn't just a commercial step forward, it was their ticket out of obscurity. They now had the chance to prove they were no longer a forgettable glam act, but a real force in metal. And in 1990, the great breakthrough arrived, Cowboys from Hell. This album wasn't just a collection of songs, it was the birth certificate of a new era in metal, groove metal. Every riff from Dimebag cut like a knife through the air, every beat from Vinnie Paul hit like a sledgehammer, and Phil's lacerating screams felt like a buzzsaw driven straight into the chest. Cowboys from Hell pulled Pantera out of the shadows, igniting an era metal had never seen before. Heavier, rawer, more brutally honest, down to the bone. From that moment, Pantera were no longer the failed glam band scorned by the underground. They were a storming force, and Phil Anselmo, with fiery eyes and primal screams, became the soul of that rebirth, a soul later etched into the memory of an entire generation of metalheads. By 1992, after nearly 2 years of relentless touring, Pantera returned to the studio with a different mindset. They didn't just want to extend the success of Cowboys from Hell. They wanted to end the era of watered-down metal and stake their claim as the decade's defining voice. The result was vulgar display of power, hailed as one of the greatest milestones in modern heavy metal. From the suffocating opening riff of Mouth for War, the compressed fury of This Love, to the immortal anthem Walk, the album was a raw manifesto. It reflected the anger, doubt, and disillusionment of a generation that felt betrayed by society, religion, and family. Among them, Walk rose as a rebel's hymn. Its simple yet haunting riff, paired with Phil's scream of "Respect, walk," hit like a slap in the face of oppressors, a direct challenge to anyone who tried to hold others down. It wasn't just heard. It was screamed together, echoing through tens of thousands of throats. From that moment, Phil Anselmo's voice became the symbol of uncompromising truth. He wasn't using technique to please crowds, nor chasing glamour. His screams came straight from his guts, raw, honest, as if each lyric was a torn wound laid bare. Phil didn't sing for entertainment. He screamed to survive. The next peak arrived in 1994 with Far Beyond Driven. If vulgar display of power was a declaration of war, then Far Beyond Driven was a hammer blow. No compromise, only sonic violence, bleak lyrics, and an extremity never seen before. Yet it was this extremity that made history. The album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, something no extreme metal record had ever achieved. At a time when grunge, pop, and alternative ruled the charts, this wasn't just Pantera's victory. It was a triumph for the entire metal community, proof that even the harshest music could conquer the mainstream. With 2 consecutive landmark albums, Pantera cemented their place as kings of global festivals. They headlined massive stages, standing alongside Metallica, Slayer, and Black Sabbath. From a despised glam band in Texas, Pantera had become an international phenomenon, the embodiment of strength, fury, and raw truth in the 1990s. But as the band reached its zenith, Phil Anselmo began his descent. Exhausting tour schedules wrecked his body. A severe back injury, built up from years of stage dives and punishing performances, tormented him daily. The pain was unbearable. He turned to opioids, then heavy drinking. When neither was enough, he embraced heroin. The tragedy struck on July 13, 1996, after a show in Dallas. Phil overdosed, and his heart stopped for nearly 5 minutes. The band thought they had lost him forever. Miraculously, he was revived. News spread like wildfire, the media stunned, fans panicked. But for Phil, it wasn't a wake-up call. It was just another marker on his self-destructive path. That same year, Pantera released The Great Southern Trendkill, their darkest, most ferocious, and most personal album. Tellingly, Phil recorded most of his vocals separately in New Orleans, away from the rest of the band in Texas. The division spoke volumes. Pantera still existed on paper, but the bond had cracked. The record carried songs like Suicide Note Panayan 2 and Floods, where Phil exposed the darkest corners of his psyche. If his earlier lyrics were declarations of war against the world, these were cries for help, suffocating in shadow. After that, things became almost irreparable. Tensions between Phil and the Abbott brothers, Dimebag Darrell and Vinnie Paul, escalated. They still stood on stage together, still smiled for the cameras. But the truth was different. No more writing together, no more confiding, no more long nights of beer and laughter. Brotherhood faded into distance, then into mistrust. By 1997, the cracks in Pantera were impossible to hide. Phil grew more distant, no longer the fiery leader, laughing, drinking, and writing as one of the pack. He rarely gave interviews, avoided the press, and often isolated himself from band activities. Fans began to wonder, was the scream that once shook the world still committed to Pantera, or had he already chosen his own path, leaving behind the brotherhood that once felt like blood? Pantera still wrote, still toured, still kept the flame alive outwardly, but the tension was undeniable. On stage, they stood together. Backstage, their souls no longer aligned. In 2000, they released Reinventing the Steel, their final studio album. It still carried ferocity with tracks like Revolution Is My Name, still had rage, still had Phil's roaring voice, but the fire of unity, the very essence that had made Pantera an unbreakable steel machine, was fading. The music remained brutal, but the brotherhood had cooled. 3 years later, in 2003, Pantera officially disbanded. No press conference, no dramatic announcement. Just a heavy silence, like a knife cut everyone knew was coming but no one dared to say aloud. For millions of fans, it was a wound without explanation. For Phil, it was like a silent sentence hanging over him. He was branded as the one who pushed Pantera to the end. Then came the ultimate tragedy. On December 8, 2004, while performing with his new band Damage Plan in Columbus, Ohio, Dimebag Darrell, the guitar genius, the brother-in-arms who had written history with Phil, was shot dead on stage by a deranged gunman. He was only 38. The entire metal world was shattered. But amid the grief, furious eyes turned toward Phil Anselmo. The reason lay in his past words. In anger, Phil had once said, "Someone needs to teach Dime a lesson." He later insisted it was nothing more than a rash remark, without malice. But the press and the public didn't forgive. They treated it like a curse, a prophecy of doom. To the Abbott family, especially Vinnie Paul, it was an unforgivable insult. At Dimebag's funeral, Phil was barred from entering. Vinnie publicly disowned him, cutting ties completely and carrying that resentment until his death in 2018. From that moment, Phil's image plunged into tragedy unlike anything before. From Pantera's soul, he became the most divisive figure in metal. Half the fans still mourned with him, finding in his voice the empathy of a man devoured by darkness, but still screaming to exist. The other half saw him as indirectly responsible for both Pantera's collapse and Dimebag's brutal death. It was a stain that would never fade, a shadow Phil would have to live with for the rest of his life. After Pantera's unofficial breakup in 2003, Phil Anselmo offered no explanation, no press conference, no attempt at justification. He simply disappeared. But that silence wasn't an ending. It was more like a retreat inward, leaving the public with a vast void, while he himself began a different journey, one where music was no longer angry screams against the world, but confessions, sentences he pronounced upon himself. While fans were still grieving Pantera's collapse, Phil quietly built another empire. Rougher, more extreme, but also far more personal. He returned to Down, the band he had formed in the mid-1990s, with New Orleans friends like Pepper Keenan, Corrosion of Conformity, and Jimmy Bower, I Hate God. Their debut album, NOLA, 1995, had already been hailed in the underground as a raw gem, but only after Pantera's end did Down become the place where Phil poured the shattered fragments of his soul into music. Down was not Pantera. If Pantera was a metallic storm blowing apart every stage, then Down was a scar, slow bleeding, heavy, drenched in darkness. It was sludge metal steeped in the American South, where sorrow doesn't scream but groans, where anger doesn't explode but smolders like embers. Albums like Down 2, A Bustle in Your Hedgerow, 2002, and Down 3, Over the Under, 2007, weren't just music. They were autobiographies in riffs, diaries written in drum beats, sighs transformed into songs. Alongside Down, Phil launched Superjoint Ritual, a project more aggressive, chaotic, and filthy than any band he had ever been in. Superjoint wasn't made to please anyone. It was like a foaming mouth, screaming out all the addictions, the endless nights, the moments when his heart had stopped only to start again by chance. With Superjoint, music wasn't a product. It was therapy, a way for Phil to expel the nightmares eating away at him. He didn't stop there. Phil also founded Philip H. Anselmo and the Illegals, a solo band where he had full control: songwriting, production, message. Walk Through Exits Only, 2013, and Choosing Mental Illness as a Virtue, 2018, were ferocious manifestos, where Phil's screams were no longer just technique, but the howl of a man tormented by the question, "Do I still deserve to be heard?" Alongside these bands, Phil created Housecore Records, an independent label for himself and for other underground acts. It wasn't a profit-driven company, but a doorway he opened for voices otherwise ignored. Phil was blunt. "If I survived everything, I have a responsibility to clear a path for those still struggling in the dark." Even on stage, he changed. No more stadiums with tens of thousands chanting Pantera's name. Now it was small venues, where fans stood close enough to see the lines etched into his face. He didn't try to recreate the past, didn't chase the ghost of glory. What he offered now was only rawness, a man who had fallen many times, standing not to conquer, but simply to prove he was still alive. With every project, every song, Phil was writing a living will, a legacy not glamorous, not easy to embrace, but haunting and honest. He once admitted, "I know I've hurt a lot of people. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want, when someone hears my music, for them to know I tried." For some, that will never be enough. But for those who still stay with him, it means everything. In the chaotic late 1990s, as Pantera began to fracture and Phil was drowning in physical pain and the spiral of addiction, he met Stephanie Opal Weinstein, a young singer-songwriter from New Orleans. Amid the familiar setting of smoke-filled clubs packed with bodies, where the stench of cigarettes and liquor clung to every fiber of clothing, Phil saw something different in Stephanie. It wasn't blind admiration, nor the curious gaze of a fan, but a gentleness laced with wildness. An artist's soul that knew how to listen and dared to touch the dark corners within him no one else would. They began dating. For Phil, Stephanie wasn't just a lover, but the only anchor holding him in place amidst the storm. On long nights, when he poured all his rage into crushing riffs and heavy melodies, Stephanie sat beside him, her soft lyrics soothing wounds that had never closed. Together they conceived the project Southern Isolation, an acoustic band, a rarity in Phil's career, which until then had been dominated by screams and distortion. The EP released in 2001 contained only 4 tracks, but they were entirely different. Raw, slow, mournful, and so intimate it felt like they were opening the doors of their souls for listeners to step inside. For the first time, fans saw a Phil who wasn't screaming against the world, but singing quietly downward, confessing his own pain. On October 31st, 2001, Phil and Stephanie married. The ceremony was modest, without lavish spectacle, but for Phil it was a major turning point. A man once known for rebellion and destruction now wore a suit and uttered vows like any other man. Friends, colleagues, and even metal fans hoped this would be his salvation, that love could pull him from self-destruction, away from drugs, and back toward the peace of a home. But marriage was no miracle. Soon enough, harsh reality revealed itself. Phil still battled relentless back pain, long nights of opioid dependency that bled into hard liquor, and eventually heroin. Stephanie, though patient and loving, slowly wore down. She endured seeing her husband lying lifeless after overdoses, endured a Phil who was at times explosively creative and passionate, and at others cold, angry, even cruelly indifferent. They never had children. Phil admitted he was never ready to be a father. Not because he disliked children, but because he couldn't even control himself. For Stephanie, this absence was a hollow wound. She longed for a family, but what she got instead was a marriage steeped in darkness and loneliness. Over time, the cracks widened into an unbridgeable chasm. Music, once their bond, no longer helped. Southern isolation faded quickly into obscurity as their love lost vitality. Eventually, they parted ways. The divorce was quiet, without scandal or public spectacle, but it left deep scars on both. For Phil, it was another painful chapter in his life's book. He had been given the chance to hold on to a piece of peace, but let it slip away, undone by the demons that never stopped tormenting him. For Stephanie, it was the shattering of an illusion. Proof that love alone wasn't enough to save a man who had grown accustomed to living in darkness. By the early 2000s, Phil Anselmo lived like an exile. Pantera was gone, his marriage to Stephanie Opal Weinstein had ended, and the metal community was torn apart by the controversies surrounding Dimebag Darrell's death. During this time, he met Kate Richardson, a woman from his hometown of New Orleans, with a background in music management and event organization. At first, Kate entered Phil's life as a collaborator. She supported underground music projects, especially as Phil began developing Housecore Records, a label dedicated to sludge, doom, and extreme metal bands neglected by the mainstream. Kate worked behind the scenes, arranging tours, coordinating media, handling details so that Phil could focus only on music. But gradually, their working relationship grew into something deeper. At a time when Phil was still staggering under addiction and failing health, Kate did not walk away. Instead, she stayed, patiently encouraging him to seek medical treatment, helping him rebuild routines. When back pain left him debilitated, Kate was there, managing medications, taking him to hospitals, or sometimes just sitting beside him so he knew he wasn't alone. Their love wasn't explosive like a frenzied metal riff, but steady, quiet, like a bass line that keeps the entire song from collapsing. They never held a grand wedding, never announced a special day. But in their own way, Kate and Phil have lived as husband and wife for many years. In interviews, Phil often calls Kate my wife, not for show, but as a simple acknowledgement. They never had children together. Phil has said openly he never felt stable enough to be a father, and Kate accepted that. Instead of a wound, the absence of children became a channel for their energy. They poured themselves into music and community. Housecore Records and the Housecore Horror Film Festival they co-founded were considered their shared child, a creation through which they nurtured young artists and gave extreme metal a place to endure. Of course, it wasn't always smooth. There were relapses into self-destructive habits, and Phil's public apology in 2016 for his Nazi salute incident sparked outrage, dragging Kate into the storm of criticism. But unlike past relationships, this time, Phil didn't lose his partner. Kate didn't blindly defend him, but she also didn't abandon him. She demanded that Phil take responsibility, confront his mistakes, and work to repair them. Because of this, for nearly 2 decades, Kate Richardson has been the most important anchor in Phil Anselmo's life. Not only his music manager, but his life partner, the one person who helped him regain balance after so many years of spiraling. In their suburban New Orleans home, they live simply with pets, a garden, and a studio where music never ceases. If his relationship with Stephanie was a naive attempt to find salvation in love, then with Kate, it is acceptance and endurance. They don't try to make each other saviors, but choose to walk through the darkness together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in exhaustion, but never letting go. But the demons inside Phil Anselmo never truly slept. In fact, they had been knocking from very early on. In 1995, after a show, he was arrested for assaulting a security guard. The incident wasn't severe enough to ruin his career, but it left the first scar. Behind the furious screams on stage, Phil was beginning to lose control in everyday life. For fans, it was just a reckless outburst, But for those close to him, it was a warning that the darkness inside was no longer fully contained. A year later, that warning became a brutal reality. On the night of July 13, 1996, after a show in Dallas, Phil overdosed on heroin and his heart stopped for nearly 5 minutes. He was revived at the last moment, surviving like a miracle. But the cost wasn't only a ravaged body, it was also the trust between him and the Abbott brothers. Dimebag and Vinnie Paul began to distance themselves, looking at Phil with a mix of fear and disappointment. From then on, the cracks within Pantera were no longer just about the music. They came from the very life of their frontman off stage. 2 decades later, when Pantera was already the past and Phil was struggling to rebuild his career with personal projects, another storm hit. On January 22, 2016, at the Dime Bash event honoring Dimebag Darrell, Phil stepped onto the stage and, in front of hundreds of fans and fellow musicians, gave a fascist-style salute and shouted, "White Power!" The video spread online within hours, sparking a wave of outrage. It wasn't just the media and the global metal fan community that erupted in anger. Even fellow musicians publicly condemned him. Scott Ian of Anthrax urged Phil to donate all his performance fees to anti-racism organizations if he wanted any chance at forgiveness. Rob Flynn of Machine Head posted a scathing video denouncing the act as indefensible. A long list of artists turned their backs in unison. The consequences were immediate. Major festivals canceled shows featuring Phil, and several music partners refused to work with him. At first, Anselmo blamed it on joking around after drinking white wine, but eventually he was forced to issue a public apology, admitting it was a stupid, irresponsible, and shameful act. Even so, the stain has never been erased. In the eyes of many, Phil remains the man who betrayed the very spirit metal once prided itself on, resisting oppression and honoring diversity. Yet Phil's life never fully closed into darkness. Though shunned, though he had fallen countless times, he never disappeared. Nearly 3 decades after Pantera's fiery peak, Phil Anselmo entered another chapter of his life. Not glorious, not loud, but quiet, scarred, and filled with repentance. In 2024, when many believed he had fully retreated into the background, Phil unexpectedly resurfaced with Scour, the extreme metal band he had formed in 2015. But instead of a grand tour, they played only a single show that year at Southport Hall in New Orleans. No massive promotion, no flashy press, the performance felt more like a secret ritual than a concert. Those present described the experience as a storm of sound, dark, violent, and so raw it resembled a collective prayer, where Phil screamed not to prove anything, but to release. Outside of music, he held on to a peculiar ritual that became his signature. Building a haunted house every Halloween on his property, then opening it for free to the local community. In behind-the-scenes clips, Phil is seen wearing a hard hat, sawing wood, stringing ropes, arranging eerie props with his own hands. No longer the defiant metal frontman, he appeared instead as a middle-aged man, savoring simple joys, as if reclaiming a rare slice of peace. Phil once said, "Demons aren't as scary as what humans do to each other. But if I can make someone laugh or scream, that's its own kind of salvation." By 2025, Phil Anselmo once again surprised the metal world. On February 21st, his band Scour released their debut album Gold. It wasn't crafted to please the market, but stood as a personal manifesto, music as a torn-apart diary. The tracks on Gold were heavy, savage, and deeply introspective, featuring a guest appearance from Gary Holt, Slayer Exodus, on the song Coin. For loyal fans, it was proof that Phil's fury remained intact, but now he could shape it into reflection. No longer just anger, but the scream of a man confronting his own wounds. More significantly, the summer of 2025 marked an event few ever thought possible. Pantera's returned to the stage. Alongside Phil was Rex Brown, the only original bandmate left. They brought in Zakk Wylde, guitar, standing in for Dimebag Darrell, and Charlie Benante, drums, replacing Vinnie Paul, to launch a U.S. tour. The media called it the Pantera Tribute Tour, but for Phil, it was a public act of repentance. He sought not to close the past with interviews or tears, but with the only language he had ever truly lived in: riffs, drums, and the screams he still had left. Every show ignited debate. Some were moved to tears at hearing the familiar roar again. Others were outraged, insisting Pantera could not exist without Dimebag and Vinnie. But when the lights fell on Phil's lined face and graying hair, no one saw a conqueror anymore. They saw a weary, yet unyielding soul, trying to sing the words he never got to say to the brothers he had lost. For more than 3 decades, Phil Anselmo's mark on heavy metal was never just about platinum albums or sold-out tours. His greatest legacy was redefining the genre's very identity. Without Anselmo, Pantera might have remained a second-rate glam band, and groove metal may never have risen as a force strong enough to challenge grunge and pop in the early 1990s. From Cowboys from Hell and vulgar display of power to Far Beyond Driven, Anselmo's primal scream opened a new era. Metal didn't need speed to be powerful, didn't need flash to overwhelm. It needed raw, jagged truth. He became a symbol for a rebellious generation, for youths who found in songs like Walk or This Love a challenge, a bond, a way out. Phil's influence extended far beyond Pantera. His projects Down, Superjoint Ritual, The Illegals, and Scour each pushed extreme metal's boundaries, from sludge, doom, and hardcore to blackened death. Through Housecore Records, he gave dozens of underground bands a foothold, opening the door for the next generation. Just as he once said, "If I survived, I have a responsibility to give others the chance to scream." And yet, his legacy is forever marred by stains that won't wash away. The fascist salute in 2016, his bitter words about Dimebag, the years of addiction and violence. They left his name a source of division in the metal world. To some, he is the soul of Pantera. To others, he is the embodiment of rebellion's darkest side. Still, one cannot deny that Phil Anselmo carved an irreplaceable mark. His voice, raw, ferocious, at times painfully bare, became part of the memory of millions. Even if he no longer stands before tens of thousands in stadiums, the songs he once screamed continue to live, like hymns for a generation that once found itself in chaos. Looking back on Phil Anselmo's journey, endless arguments arise: genius or self-destroyer, icon or stain. Yet it is precisely this contradiction that gives him weight in rock history. Phil never tried to be a role model, and perhaps that is why his story strikes with such raw truth: that music, like humanity, can both save and destroy. Today, as the stage lights fade, what remains is not a perfect legend, but a living witness to both the strength and fragility of an artist's soul. And perhaps that is Phil Anselmo's deepest gift: not to be worshipped, but to force us to reflect on the price of passion and freedom. And you, when you hear Phil's screams tearing through the air, what do you feel? A challenge, a cry for help, or simply an unerasable fragment of your youth? Share your thoughts below, and if this story touched you in any way, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to continue exploring the rock and roll lives that once shook an entire generation.